Most RPGs feature various monsters and enemies, but games that focus on horror-like imagery and atmosphere are quite rare. So here's a list of horror RPGs I compiled last December in anticipation of Bloodborne. Note that I won't include any currently untranslated RPGs that were never brought overseas. I've searched high and low and haven't been able to find any more games that fit the criteria, but if I miss something, please point it out in the comments. Although not the first game of its kind, SSI's Veil of Darkness is one of the handful of isometric action RPGs that predate Diablo. While they share a similar perspective, the two games are nothing alike. Whereas Diablo is light in story and all about combat, here the latter is almost an afterthought, while much emphasis is placed on talking to NPCs and solving puzzles. It's a much more cerebral experience. It plays like a classic dialogue-heavy RPG, even to the point of having an Ultima 7 style inventory system. There's no character creation, stats, nor do you gain experience by killing enemies, but combat is still based on dice rolls. It's also very shallow and clunky, but thankfully you can control the weapon in each hand by pressing 1 and 2, so you don't have to constantly click your mouse. There isn't any depth of strategy to these battles beyond few enemies being impervious to certain weapons. For example, you need to kill skeletons using a mace. Dungeons where you're forced to slaughter a lot of enemies are the low point of this game, especially this lengthy maze that has no music for some reason. Thankfully, the rest of the game is good, even to the point where I'd consider it a hidden gem. You play as an American pilot who crashes into a remote and backwards Romanian village that's terrorized by a vampire and a werewolf, who you must find amongst the villagers. Over the course of the game, you solve 7 tasks, which were foretold in a prophecy. There's a branching conversation system that's based on keywords, but you also have the option for writing your own responses, though the mandatory use of this feature is limited to a few instances. Although it's a non-linear game, it's structured in a way that makes it easier to figure out what to do. You unlock more locations on the world map by talking to people, and there's a group of NPCs in the first town that give you hints. It's easy to stay on track of what to do for the most part, but there are a few problems that I couldn't figure out. For example, you need to eat a mushroom that temporarily blinds you when you fight Dracula, otherwise he'll brainwash you with his gaze. I don't know how you're supposed to figure that out without trying to eat a mushroom and seeing if it has any effect, though it could be that I missed a clue in a line of dialogue. Where Veil of Darkness excels at is its atmosphere. The dark and autumnal setting is complemented by some of the nicest music I've ever heard in a DOS game. It might not sound like high praise, but I was reminded of RuneScape when I played this game. There's just something about these early 90s isometric graphics that makes the experience appealing and cozy. Baroque is a first-person real-time roguelike that's similar in its aesthetics and mood with the Silent Hill and Shin Megami Tensei series. Both are some of my favorite series in gaming, so I couldn't hope for a better combination. The storyline is deliberately obtuse, the soundtrack has a pulsating sound to it, and the dreary color palette is dominated by shades of brown and red. Many of the NPCs you meet are also weird and twisted in different ways.
Have you seen that female ghost?
She disappears into the walls.
Ghosts are frightening, even in a world like this.
I do not have a name, so you may call me what you like. Quit it. I've no reason to fight with you.
The game takes place in a post-apocalyptic setting, with most of humanity has either been wiped out or turned to monsters. The player gets dropped in the world without much explanation, so fans of Dark Souls might enjoy this game for that aspect. The gameplay is nothing out of the ordinary for a roguelike. You go around killing enemies and exploring a dungeon called Narrow Tower. If you die, you'll lose everything, and you'll have to go back to the beginning of the dungeon. While you can throw objects at enemies to cause status effects, the combat is just button mashing with no real depth to it. That doesn't mean it's easy though. Like other roguelikes, this game is more a war of attrition. There's more figuring out what items work against certain enemies through trial and error. The game originally got its start on the Saturn and PS1 in Japan. While the original versions are more limited, their low-res nature actually makes them more creepy. Some of that was lost in translation to the new 3D graphics. I'd also argue that the main character's design on the PS2 and Wii version detracts a bit from the overall atmosphere. But even the version that the English-speaking world received is still very unique. I've covered this game at length in my Looking Glass Studios retrospective, so check that out if for some reason you haven't heard of System Shock 2. I will say that it's the only game on this list that's actually consistently scary, and it's one of the best survival horror games of all time. Troika's Vampire the Masquerade, Bloodlines, is one of the finest Western RPGs made during the 21st century, and an interesting mix of old and new game design. While it isn't consistently scary, it has some of the scariest levels seen in an RPG. Bloodlines is based on a popular pen and paper RPG, and the game benefits massively from this. Even if it isn't entirely faithful to the source material, the character creation is easily one of the most deep and robust systems seen in an action RPG. The game world also feels much bigger and complex than it really is, thanks to all the pre-existing lore the writers could reference. You play as a vampire, but the game takes place in modern-day Los Angeles rather than cliched old Transylvania or New Orleans. The central storyline is centered around a power struggle between different vampire factions, who fight for different political agendas. The Camarilla is the largest of them. They enforce the laws of vampire society, mainly the notion of the masquerade. No human should be allowed to know that vampires exist, and everyone caught breaking the masquerade is sentenced to death. This rule applies to you as well, so while you must periodically quench your thirst for blood or risk going into a frenzy, you must be careful not to kill innocent people. If you get too many violations, it's game over.
And another thing, you've been attracting a lot of attention to yourself. Mortal attention. But I'm going to overlook it for now. But keep breaking the masquerade, and I guarantee you'll never break it again.
There are other sects as well, like the left-leaning anarchs, who are sick and tired of Camarilla's elitism. This game throws quite a lot of new names and terminology at you, and while it might sound like it would be hard to keep track of it all, the scheming and petty politicking of different tribes makes it easy to get invested in the storyline. It's no different from Harry Potter or any other well-written piece of fiction. It makes you care about the world so much that you start to memorize all the made-up words. As the game borrows lore from an extensive pen and paper system, the writers could make the world feel larger than what's shown on the screen. That's one of the many great things about the writing. Although you rise up in the ranks of vampire society over the course of the game, there's an ever-present sense that you're just a tiny cog in a larger machine. Many high-ranking vampires can trace their bloodline thousands of years back, and what's happening in LA is just one small part of the world of darkness. However, it's not the storyline itself that makes Bloodlines' writing so excellent. Rather, it's the characters and the dialogue. The game is filled with clever writing from quests to urban legends, and GTA-style radio commercials, which are hilarious and even satirize the game at one point.
The new horror RPG from Troika Games. Red!
Oh, I can tell you where the bakery is, stranger, but before I do, would you mind picking up my little girl from the lake?
You are the monster. Or are you?
If you want to enter this bakery, you'll have to defeat me. And this torch!
Frankenstein, Breadlust, coming soon to a PC near you.
This is just anecdotal, but what I remember most from my first playthrough was how immersed in the game world I was, due to how the quests are structured and written. It never felt like I was doing artificial fetch quests for NPCs. For example, when you're asked to retrieve the tape of a snuff film, a scared courier tells you that he hid it, and only says the name Ginger Swans as a clue. you'll find out that she's a celebrity who died decades ago, so you've got to go search her grave. Later on, you can actually hear a news broadcast which talks about how her grave was desecrated. But that's only the first half of the mission. To find the second part, you're told to ask around from local smut peddlers. So you've got to figure out yourself to question the proprietor of the local adult store. He tells you to try using a password on a local payphone. It might not sound like much, but these missions feel very genuine due to their non-linear gameplay. Although the hub worlds aren't very big, they're densely packed with content, and are openly explorable. So they do a good job of crafting the illusion that the game world is a real living place that reacts to your actions, which it does to some extent.
I know. I heard you from here. So you like loud noises, do you? I asked you to be quiet. All you've done is attract attention to yourself. And now you're in my club. You think there's any chance someone might make the connection? I don't know if you've helped or made things worse.
Because you occasionally have to do some research and think for yourself, the game world feels very immersive as it behaves in a realistic way. But the areas are small enough that you'll never get truly stumped, though there are side missions you can easily miss or not be able to complete. This game has some of the best content and quests that I've ever seen in an RPG. That's because, with a few exceptions, the NPCs feel authentic and believable, no small thanks to the modern setting and prosaic dialogue.
The Sabbat are worthless, man. Fake tits on a zombie worthless. Fun to watch, though, like the Three Stooges with chainsaws. Yeah, they're mostly Camarilla, but they suck when it comes to execution. The Sabbat are in the same business as the Camarilla. Sabbat have a little longer chain, but they're slaves all the same.
Another major contributing factor to this high level of immersion is the excellent voice acting, which is complemented by great facial animations. It's the first game besides Half-Life 2 to run on the Source engine, and the characters are almost as realistic. But as it's an RPG, you've got different dialogue options, which affect the way people react to you. That just makes the motion capture even more impressive. As for the gameplay, it's a mix of FPS combat and RPG character building. At the start of the game, you get to decide which clan you belong to. There are 13 clans total, though only 7 are playable. Each are different with their own set of strengths, weaknesses, and spells. For example, members of the aristocratic Ventru clan can assert their will on others in conversations, but they can't suck the blood of prostitutes or homeless bums because that would make them throw up. The two most interesting clans are the Nosferatu and the Malkavians. Members of the Nosferatu clan have the most monstrous and hideous appearance, so they must travel in sewers as they would stand out in the crowd if they walked on the street. But they gain more blood when feeding upon rats, as they can't lure hookers to dark alleyways like members of the more charismatic clans.
What? Oh, man. And you're a goddamn Malkavian, too. Wow. You really are fucked.
Mercurio, if that's what you mean. Oh, shit, you're a Malkavian, aren't you?
Malkavians are crazy and share an ancestral hive mind, so their often poetic dialogue options might sound like insane gibberish. Actually, sometimes their options are so insightful that they are actually spoilers of what's going to happen later, but there's no way a first-time player could decipher that from their ravings. They also have some unique reactions, like hearing a dinosaur statue roar in a museum, and being able to argue with a stop sign. The game builds on the foundation of Deus Ex in the same vein that Arcanum built on Fallout's foundation. There are 21 different attributes and skills to specialize in, like firearms, melee combat, computers, stealth, and seduction. There are also 11 different schools of magic, which each have up to 5 unique spells in them, though each clan only has access to 3 of the specific schools. Basically, the gameplay is like Deus Ex, with the addition of social skills such as haggle and persuasion. Plus, different playable races affect how different people react to you and what skills you can learn. However, the game does not stack up to its standards when it comes to the game design. For starters, there's more skills that are imbalanced or useless, even without most of the metagame knowledge. The game world is also more static, so you can't blow up doors or do other things like that due to the less interactive environments. Though in many areas, that seems like an intentional design decision, as the economy is rigidly balanced. While neither game has outstanding combat, the RPG systems were integrated to the real-time battles far better in Deus Ex. Shooting guns can feel very clunky and unsatisfying in this game, so it's advisable that you specialize in melee combat. You can perform instant kills with melee weapons when you're stealthy, but regular hand-to-hand combat can feel quite unwieldy due to the hidden strings of character attributes. Sometimes you can't hit an enemy, even when you're furiously clicking the attack button, and animation bugs are quite frequent. At least the spells are fun to use, but they consume blood, so every time you get into a firefight with a large group of enemies, you have to leave one of them untouched so that you can drain them of their blood. You do have the option of consuming blood bags to replenish mana, but they're very expensive, so I doubt their viability outside of boss battles. Maybe if you max out your haggling skill it could work, but I've never tried that. Whereas Deus Ex is a paragon of 3D level design, Bloodlines becomes a linear trek through monster-filled sewers in later stages. And you'll have to face multiple bosses that can be impossible to beat if you don't develop a sufficiently combat-oriented character, as the level designer simply didn't make stealth, brainwashing, spellcasting, and talking your way out of trouble viable options in later missions. That's the biggest flaw in this game, as the last third is considerably less polished than the first 20 hours or so. But there's no reason to skip out on this title, as it's an amazing experience up to that point. Even after the infamous sewer portion in Hollywood, there's still plenty of memorable missions and side quests to complete. Only the last few missions have truly uninspired design. Getting back to my comparisons, the way the game is structured is also different from Deus Ex. Bloodlines is an open-world game, but is divided into 4 hub worlds. You can freely travel between Santa Monica, downtown, Hollywood, and Chinatown. There are plenty of interesting and varied side quests you can do within these cities. However, story missions often take place in separate locations, which you can only visit once. They're designed in a more linear manner, which finally brings us to why this game is on the list. There are some scary missions in Bloodlines. A level where you must visit a haunted hotel to retrieve a trinket is one of the earliest missions in the game, and it won a level design award. Another memorable example is one side quest where you end up in a basement of an insane man that dismembers people, which you don't realize until it's too late. There's plenty of blood and gore in the game, more than any other title on this list, and you'll be fighting against plenty of undead enemies as well. Some of them are standard zombies, others have more unique and disturbing design. But the horror elements are only part of what makes Bloodlines stand out from other RPGs. The parts where you aren't slaying zombies by the hundreds are equally enjoyable due to the wonderfully gritty and urban atmosphere that very few games have managed to pull off. To quote a loading screen tip, the world of darkness is as horrifying as it is cosmopolitan. Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines is an essential title in the pantheon of modern RPGs. While it's not without its flaws and technical difficulties, the stellar writing, engrossing atmosphere, and abundant personality are unrivaled by AAA games and indie titles alike. There's also a preceding game in the series called Redemption. It's not as well liked as Bloodlines, so I haven't played it yet, but I've read that it has some redeeming qualities. There's also a newer vampire action RPG called Bloodlust Shadowhunter. Sacknoth is a peculiar developer. They got their start by making 2 submarine RPGs for the Neo Geo Pocket Color, as well as Facele, one of the most sought-after games on the system. But they are more well known for the Shadowheart series, which actually got its start on the PlayStation. Koudelka is an interesting, albeit flawed, mix of Resident Evil and light SRPG combat. The game is set in the late 19th century Wales, and takes place in a sprawling monastery filled with puzzles and locked doors that's very reminiscent of the mansion seen in Resident Evil 1. This game is by far the darkest game in the series. The mood is quite nice, but the pre-rendered backgrounds aren't as pretty as in other contemporary games. In fact, they look quite blurry, like the low-res textures were stretched too much. But that could just be the fact that I'm not playing with a CTR monitor. The visuals do their job, but some areas are insufficiently lighted, while others look too light. The surprisingly well-delivered voice acting deserves some praise. The RPG elements come from the fact that you control a party and the battles are turn-based. Unlike in many other JRPGs, you actually get to choose which stats to upgrade when leveling up. While there's hardly any depth in combat, movement is still grid-based like a tactical RPG. Another seemingly Final Fantasy Tactics-inspired feature is the fact that spellcasting isn't instantaneous. Your weapons also break from use, so you have to be careful to save better weapons for tougher encounters. Sadly, the game is bogged down by constant random battles which make backtracking a pain. They aren't challenging but take too much time due to grid-based movement and the fact that it takes time to cast spells. It's a shame, because otherwise it's a really interesting game. Shadow Hearts improves the combat and is overall a more polished and enjoyable experience. This time you play as a guy who can morph into different demonic forms. The grid-based battles were stripped away in favor of more classic JRPG combat, though you can move characters between the front and back rows. While Koudelka added survival horror tension to the battles with weapon degradation, here you got to watch out for the sanity of your party members, otherwise they'll go insane and start attacking you. This mechanic makes boss fights tense, as you have to spend turns just using consumables to increase sanity, which can be dangerous if someone's health is low or the boss is about to do a hard-hitting attack. Another feature that can increase the tension of combat is the new Judgment Ring mechanic, which means you've got to perform a quick-time event every single time you want to perform an action in combat. If you fail, your turn will be wasted, but if you're really good, you can actually do bonus damage or healing. My thoughts on this mechanic are mixed. On one hand, it means you can die in combat if you're not careful enough. It's also quite fun to use as every hit is accompanied by a satisfying sound effect. But ultimately, it's a gimmicky quick-time event, and you shouldn't add reflex-based mechanics to a turn-based battle system. When it comes to the horror aspects, Shadow Hearts is kind of a step down. Although it has some great moments, one of the first areas you run to is a cannibal village that's covered in blood, but soon after that, you travel to Asia and spend a lot of time in cities and little villages. Sure, the enemies are kind of Lovecraftian, and much of the game happens during nighttime, but it's mostly just dark and moody rather than being overtly horror. So don't expect tons of blood and gore, or System Shock 2 level scariness. But like I said, the game has its moments. I'm sure everyone who has played it can remember the mirror scene. It also has an interesting new mechanic. Every time you kill monsters, your malice meter fills up. If it gets too high, a powerful boss will come after you, which you must face alone. It can easily kill you, so you must periodically visit a cemetery and fight a boss there instead to reset your malice. Visually, Shadow Hearts is really nice, a big improvement from Koudelka. Thankfully, the developers stick to pre-rendered backgrounds. Fonts and speech bubbles are also stylized to fit the era the game takes place in. Speaking of which, I almost forgot to mention that there seem to be some anachronistic elements, as the game takes place during the First World War, but some story elements seem to be historically inaccurate. But one of the characters actually uses a cell phone to call in her special attack, so that's to be expected. For what it's worth, I played this game for the first time last October, and I look back on the experience fondly. There's a lot of long scenes where all you do is press X and read dialogue, and the middle part of the game is less dark. But for what it is, Shadow Hearts is a very enjoyable JRPG, and it's just a bit over 20 hours if you don't do the side quests, so it doesn't overstay its welcome. I haven't played the 2 sequels. From what I've read, each new iteration is more humorous and less dark than the preceding one, and the final game in the series turned me off from it with its cover art alone. It's a shame that one isn't in short supply, whereas Shadow Hearts and Shadow Hearts Covenant are quite uncommon and pricey in Europe. I wouldn't classify Planescape Torment as a true horror RPG, but like the Disgaea series, it uses a lot of horror imagery, so it's worth a mention. However, I won't get into too much detail as I'll probably cover the game later on in some other video. Planescape Torment is often hailed as the most well-written video game of all time. It is clearly one of the best and most unique RPGs up to date. The game starts off with your character waking up from a mortuary with no memory on how he got there, and his body filled with tattoos that urge him to find a man named Farad. The game establishes a dark mood from the get-go, as you're surrounded by the undead and weird cultists that worship death. Once you escape the mortuary, you find yourself in a dirty and disgusting city filled with all kinds of exotic races and factions. While the mood is more philosophical and surrealistic, you'll run into plenty of dark and morbid stuff in this game. Planescape Torment is famous for subverting RPG tropes, which can be seen in the fact that some of the most sympathetic characters are actually undead, while rats are some of the most formidable foes in the entire game. A game of this magnitude deserves a much more detailed review than that. Just play it for yourself if you haven't already. If you in any way care about story or writing in video games, you won't be sorry. Waxworks, not to be confused with a text adventure from the early 80s, is mostly notable for its death scenes. It's one of the goriest games of its era. In this real-time dungeon crawler, you travel to different time periods through works in a wax museum. There's a graveyard filled with zombies, an Egyptian tomb, Victorian London where Jack the Ripper is on the loose, and an underground mine that's filled with weird plant creatures. The RPG mechanics are really shallow and wonky in this title. Sometimes you level up simply by walking around, and the lethargic real-time combat isn't satisfying in any way due to the lack of audio feedback, though you can dismember enemies. And when you complete an area, your level gets reset and you lose your weapons. This is more of an adventure game where you solve puzzles in order to make progress than a hack-and-slash RPG. For example, in London, you'll be mistaken for Jack the Ripper, and you have to avoid the cops or otherwise you'll get hanged. Horrorsoft also made 2 Elvira games prior to Waxworks. They were very similar in style. The strategy developer Microprose took the RPG world by surprise when it released the revolutionary and historically accurate sandbox RPG Darklands in 1992. A year later they tried their luck with an RPG adventure hybrid called BloodNet, this time in a cyberpunk setting where you would play as a vampire. There are 2 kinds of cyberpunk games. The kind where cyberpunk's core tenets shape the setting, and the kind where they form the entire identity of the game. BloodNet falls firmly in the latter category, as it was made in an era when the internet was still a bit of a mystery, and it was thought that in the future, most new words would have the prefix cyber in them. This game is truly a product of its era, and if you like cyberpunk, you must experience it. You've got your own decking unit, which you can use to jack your brain into cyberspace, where you can talk to other hackers. But you must be careful as some hackers got caught with their neural implants went haywire, which messed up their brains and means that they can only speak in gibberish. Naturally, the game world is ruled by megacorporations, and there's not much else going on in the lives of the inhabitants other than fighting the man, doing drugs, gang wars, illegal arms trade, and endless poetry. Although that's standard fare for cyberpunk, there's a lot of weird stuff to give the world some personality. There are areas which look like they were designed by Salvador Dali, and there's a weird discrepancy between characters and backgrounds. The sprites are way too small in proportion to their environment. and conversations can also take a turn for the surreal at times. You come across some real oddball characters, like the one who speaks in crossword puzzles. While the dialogue is riddled with outdated cyberpunk lingo, the writing and conversations are quite enjoyable. What's not so enjoyable is pretty much everything else about this game. It's completely non-linear and littered with side quests, but you're actually punished for exploring. As your character is a vampire, your bloodlust level goes up over time. Once it reaches a certain point, this sound effect will start looping. So you've got to feed on people. But there's a limit to how many you can kill, as you'll lose humanity, and it's possible to kill plot-important NPCs. If you want to beat this game, you pretty much have to follow a walkthrough despite the facade of RPG systems and open-ended gameplay. Even then, you can easily get stumped by some of the mandatory fights, which are awful. Although the game is turn-based and lets you choose where to place your character in combat, there aren't any redeeming qualities to the combat system. If this was a standalone review, I'd describe in detail what's wrong with the system, but I don't want to bloat this video with unnecessary ranting, so just take my word for it that the combat in this game is awful. And so does the UI for that matter. You'd think that it would be hard to mess up point-and-click driven interface, but your character has a lot of pathfinding issues, and some features are hidden like your item and equip screen, which is accessed by pressing 1. Despite the lackluster combat system, it is a full-fledged RPG. You can jury-rig items, recruit people to your party, and there are 26 stats which determine things like whether or not you can find certain items, what kind of price you'll barter when buying items, and so on. But this isn't a thoroughly play-tested, well-balanced, or fair game, so if you build your character wrong or do things in a wrong order, you might get stuck. While the idea of a cyberpunk RPG like this is great, the fact is that the developers spread themselves too thin with the inclusion of all these RPG mechanics. This is by no means a good game, but it's nice to soak in the cyberpunk atmosphere by going around talking to people, though I suggest playing it on the Amiga if possible. The PC version has horrible music. Quest for Glory: Shadows of Darkness is a far better example of an adventure RPG hybrid. It's one of Sierra's best games and often considered to be the best installment in the franchise that showed the gaming world how you could combine the two genres. The game is set in a land called Mordavia. The setting draws heavy influence from Russian and Eastern European mythology, but also has some Lovecraftian undertones. Like Veil of Darkness, Shadows of Darkness also nails the rural Romanian vibe perfectly. The music is memorable and backgrounds have a beautiful hand-painted look to them. Though as it's a Sierra game, the production values are noticeably higher and the overall tone is more humorous. John Rhys-Davies, who played Gimli, voices the narrator and he does a great job. That's a good thing as Sierra games tend to have a lot of text. In fact, according to an interview, the game had 5 times as many lines written for John as he had signed up for. You can pretty much inspect every single object in every single scene.
You are in a large cave, dimly lit by glowing lichen on the walls. Strange, irregular outcroppings of stone grow from the ground, looking like the skeleton of some enormous beast. Here and there, petrified human bodies seem to grow. You stumble and fall over the... As you pick yourself up, you discover a dagger and some coins on the dried-out dead body. It isn't going to use them anymore, so you take them.
However, the most memorable performances were done by a trio of voice actors who voiced Hans, Franz, and Ivan, a trio of xenophobic farmers who spend their time in a local tavern. All 3 of them improvised some funny lines that were left in the game. Hands down the most memorable side characters I've seen in a Sierra adventure.
Mordavian nights are dangerous.
Oh, he's right, you know. Nobody goes out at night, except my girlfriend, but she's working.
Her and a few ghosts, and revenants, a wraith, and vampire or 2.
Hold it, put it in part. There are no vampires in Mordavia.
Vampires in Moldavia. Whoever heard of such nonsense?
I hate to burst your bubble, but my Uncle Fred was bitten by a vampire once.
Your Uncle Fred's alive and well and retired till Silmaria? Hello?
Yeah, I know him. He sends you a postcard every harvest time saying, "Where's my $20?"
Yeah, he says he's a real jester.
He dresses like Sonny Bono.
And he acts like a gnome.
He is a gnome, Einstein.
Quest for Glory games are also well designed due to their RPG elements and the developers' insistence on making puzzles comprehensible. As there are 3 different classes, most puzzles have multiple solutions and are thus less cryptic. You may use brawn, magic, or an agile approach. However, the negative side of the coin is the fact that you have to do some grinding in order to boost your stats, which can mean anything from hitting the gym to repeatedly throwing rocks or casting spells till the sunset. You also have to eat and sleep on a regular basis, but it's never a hassle. Compared to regular adventure games, you do a fair bit of back and forth backtracking as you always return to the town to get supplies and rest. You'd think that it would be tedious, but after exploring the dark tombs and the misty forests and swamps of Mordavia, it always feels comforting to return to the warmth of the tavern. The forest is especially dangerous during night, when many undead creatures roam around. Like in all adventure RPG hybrids, the combat system is really bad in this game, but at least battles are practically automated, so they aren't a focal point of the design. The inclusion of RPG elements is a mixed bag. Some of the RPG mechanics enhance the adventure gameplay, while others hinder it. For example, the ability to perform many actions that aren't in any way related to inventory puzzles makes the game feel more immersive and realistic. Combining the system interaction of a CRPG with the production values and story-centric approach of an adventure game make up for an enjoyable experience that feels neither too linear and mechanically limited, nor focused on repetitive grinding. Another beneficial RPG carryover is the day and night cycle. The game world isn't static, and you'll meet new people over time. Some events can be triggered only by a certain time of day, which means that you have to sneak out of town at night when the gates are barred. One of the most memorable moments for me was when I ran into a creature called Domovoy while I was sneaking out at night, as I had done so many times, but suddenly realizing that a weird creature was staring at me was startling in a way. That's a great example of how you don't have to resort to loud noises and jump scares to put your player on the edge. A subtle, yet noticeable difference in a familiar scene is enough to achieve the same effect. There's also a big pile of rocks in the woods that looks like a hunched troll. You can easily miss it, but if you pay attention to it, it's easy to think that it'll come to life if you run too close to it. While it's not really a great RPG when it comes to character building and the combat system, it's a must-play title in the adventure genre. Back when Square was at the top of their game after the release of Final Fantasy VII, they experimented with projects like Parasite Eve. Although when compared to other Square RPGs of the time, this game is quite original. It's not hard to trace its lineage, though. Resident Evil 2 had hit the scene a few months earlier, and JRPGs were at the height of their popularity, though the game itself is an adaptation of a Japanese sci-fi novel that was released in 1995. The story revolves around mitochondria and other biological subjects, as the novel was written by a pharmacologist. It's mostly a justification for numerous CGI transformation cutscenes that look like they're inspired by The Thing. While these scenes are quite grotesque, and you do fight against all kinds of deformed beasts in this game, the game isn't scary, nor does it seem to be concerned about being a true survival horror game. That doesn't bother me, as the dark imagery could be thought more as a stylistic choice that helps to set the game further apart from other contemporary JRPGs. Parasite Eve doesn't want to conform to the norm, but it also doesn't want to deviate too far from the formula that worked at the time. The quasi-real-time battle system uses the foundation of the familiar active-time battle system, but revamps it to work in a combat situation where you are alone in a cramped area and must dodge enemy projectiles. The art style is much more realistic than that of Final Fantasy VII. It uses pre-rendered style to good effect. Though due to its urban setting, the backgrounds aren't as imaginative and memorable. The music, on the other hand, is. While Yoko Shimomuru's effort might not reach the same level as Nobuo Uematsu's legendary work, there's no denying that Parasite Eve has a good soundtrack with some catchy and memorable tunes in it. Especially the intro theme gets me pumped up every time, which can be credited in equal measure to the good directing. These music video-like intro scenes are something that JRPGs and Japanese games in general did very well during the PS1 generation. But despite the awesome intro, Parasite Eve's promises of a cinematic RPG experience fall flat. I guess you could say the overall story is structured in a movie-like manner, as the game is very linear and doesn't feature all that many characters, so the narrative never loses focus. It's obviously scaled back down from Final Fantasy VII, but this more limited scale fits Parasite Eve well. It's short for an RPG, but there isn't any padding. I haven't said anything about the mechanics yet because I mostly wanted to focus on the story and atmosphere, as that's where this game excels at. There's a weapon modification system, which I never fully grasped. Random battles happen in the same area that you're exploring, which is always nice, but the combat isn't all that great. It does its job, and it doesn't suffer from frame rate issues, or hit detection, or anything like that, and you have to manage your ammo and plan ahead a bit, as you've got to wait for a timer to fill between actions. But like so many other JRPGs, the gameplay can start to feel like a chore due to the frequent random encounters, which is especially annoying when you're trying to explore an area, as some later areas require you to do backtracking. While ammo conservation fits the theme, it mostly just adds a layer of tedium into the battles as you constantly have to switch between weapons, which further prolongs battles. While you might get stuck with random battle fatigue at some point in the game, Parasite Eve is still a worthy title, with a nice mood, even if I personally don't rate this game as high as some others seem to do. And like I said earlier, it's really short for an RPG, so completing it only takes a few days during first playthrough. New Game Plus offers the Chrysler Building, a huge optional dungeon for those who can't get enough of the battle system and weapon upgrading. Parasite Eve 2 has a far more robust battle system, removing the weapon modifications and waiting for gauges to fill up, as well as offering unlimited 9mm ammo to relieve that other layer of tedium. It also does away with random encounters entirely, as there is a strict limit to the number of enemies that can be fought in the game. I won't go into more detail as, despite having a few disturbing scenes, it's not really a horror game, instead more focused on its combat. Micropro's legacy Realm of Terror is to my knowledge the first Lovecraftian CRPG. It's set in the modern times, but in a haunted mansion that your character has just inherited from a dead relative. At the start of the game, you can choose from a roster of different characters, some of whom know how to cast spells. For an action RPG, you have a fair bit of choice when it comes to developing your character, as there are 5 main attributes and 12 sub-skills. Unfortunately, some skills are far less useful than others, so it's easy to accidentally gimp your character. When you combine this fact with the high difficulty and scarce ammunition at early stages of the game, it's easy to see why the game didn't do very well. It's an early survival horror game, but contemporary critics expected it to play just like any other action RPG. I assume most people who played this didn't have the patience to learn its quirks, so they never got far enough to see all the weird Lovecraftian stuff that happens later on. While the game plays like any other real-time dungeon crawler of the era, it's reminiscent of Alone in the Dark in Resident Evil in the fact that you wander around a huge mansion that has loads of locked doors and secrets. Resources like chainsaw gas and medkits are scarce. so you aren't supposed to be able to kill everything that moves. One interesting feature of the UI is that you can modify it to your liking, as if you were resizing windows at your desktop. Visually, Legacy looks quite impressive for 93 standards, with this pre-rendered Fox 3D look to many environments and enemies. One thing I want to mention about the sound is that when I recorded the footage of my original video, there's one sound effect that I couldn't capture. If you try to leave the house at the start of the game, you'll hear an ominous laugh. For some reason, no matter how I render the footage, that sound effect would always disappear. Every other sound in the game worked just fine. And if you can find the coveted Radio Shack Collector's Edition of this game, it comes with a mechanism that produces moaning sounds, evil laughter, and other sound effects when you open the game box. But just the regular version of the game goes for more than $100 on eBay, so good luck with that. Here's a game that needs no introduction. I'm sure I don't have to explain how Diablo works, but I suppose it's worth noting that the original game was the darkest in the series. In fact, it's one of the darkest RPGs, period. There are two Dungeons & Dragons games that use the horror-inspired Ravenloft license, Strahd's Possession and Stone Keep. Strahd's Possession takes place in Transylvanian setting, filled with vampires. Stone Keep is set in an Egyptian time setting. Both are real-time dungeon crawlers with 3D graphics, which is why I haven't played either very far. The mouse-driven interfaces just don't fit into the action RPG where you have to mind your surroundings and attack and cast spells with all your characters. But I've read people praise the atmosphere of these games, so they warrant a mention. Visually, these games are a big step up from the Gold Box titles, and they even include voice acting. So it's a shame that the gameplay isn't very good. But there's an in-game mapping feature, so it's easy to try out and see if these games are your cup of tea or not. I don't really see Escape from Hell as a horror RPG, but some abandonware sites classify it as such. The game uses the Wasteland engine and is set in Hell as envisioned in Dante's Inferno, though it was scaled back from 9 Circles of Hell to 3 at the behest of the publisher EA. And EA probably knows more about their home than anybody else, so we'll take their word for it that there's only 3 circles. The reason why I wouldn't classify this game as a horror RPG is the fact that there's a lot of humor in the game. It's one of the most zany RPGs ever made. You come across many famous people, some of whom want to join your party, while others oppose you. What other RPG lets you have a nail gun wielding Stalin, or Hitler with an Uzi as your party member? Although Escape from Hell is very humorous, it also portrays Hell in a serious light. The bizarre enemy designs and some of the events you stumble across are quite nightmarish. The enemy portraits are sometimes animated and look really good given the standards of the time and the fact that the game was made by just 2 people. It's not mechanically great, and it suffers from cut content, but the writing and the overall thought that was put into the world building are both above average. The RPG mechanics and combat system aren't very deep, but at least the combat system is non-intrusive and turn-based. It isn't slowed down by unnecessary animations, so you can just hammer the attack command and be done with random battles in an instant. While the gameplay isn't very exciting, the clever writing and unique setting make Escape from Hell a worthy pick for people who are more experienced with RPGs and are looking for something new to play. The UI is remarkably easy to use, so for an old-school CRPG, it's really easy to get into. You know those Japanese horror RPGs like Aooni and Corpse Party that have been growing in popularity the last few years? One could easily argue that Sweet Home is the granddaddy of them all. In fact, Sweet Home may even be considered the progenitor of the entire survival horror genre. Although Project Firestart also laid out the foundation for the genre that same year. Even then, Sweet Home remains a very seminal title for both Japanese RPGs and horror games, despite its relative obscurity in the West. Just how foundational was Sweet Home to the genre? Well, how about we take the classic survival horror game Resident Evil and do a side-by-side comparison with Sweet Home. As soon as the game starts, we find ourselves locked in a huge, spooky mansion. Terrible things have happened before the player's arrival. We learn of these atrocities from notes, diaries, and other written accounts. Locked doors everywhere you turn. There are no shops or currency. You have to find your weapons and other items where you can. Healing is strictly limited. There are no inns, or even beds to sleep in. No healing spells. The only way you can heal is to use items, and those are precious, as there is a limited number of them in the game. Inventory management. The player is always struggling to carry as much as possible, yet still being forced to leave valuable things behind. Remember, previous RPGs all allowed nearly unlimited space, letting you carry every sword you ever found along with 99 tents if it so pleased you. Sweet Home really is a landmark title that the rest has remained largely ignorant of. Today, amid the sea of indie titles, the words breaks from conventions doesn't mean all that much. But in 1989, just 2 years after the release of the original Final Fantasy, the conventions were still new. The last thing I have to talk about is the artistic detail in this game. When you compare Sweet Home to other RPGs of the time, you won't notice a lot of difference. That is, until your first battle starts. All of a sudden you find yourself confronted with sprites like these. Not only do these far surpass other NES RPGs in terms of detail, but they go so far as to animate many of them. And then there's this cutscene. You won't find anything like that in any other 8-bit RPG. If there was ever a game that deserved an HD remake, it's Sweet Home.